I'm Ann Hargrave, Chair of the Summer Lecture Series B. This morning's presentation is a bit of a change from our usual lecture format. The speakers will act as a panel in the first hour and take your questions as a panel in the Q&A. I would like to welcome you and our sister OSHERs, the University of Massachusetts, Boston, the University of Georgia in Athens, and the University of Richmond in Richmond, Virginia. I want also to thank our season sponsors, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Caldwell Law, Estate Planning and Settlement, Dale and Lohman, Wealth Management Group, Kendall and Hanover, the Village of White River Junction, and the sponsor for this session, Alex Tacday. Please write your questions on the index cards as usual. People watching remotely can use the chat function. I will be waiting to collect your cards. Please silence your cell phones and locate the exit nearest you in case of an emergency. There will be a post-lecture discussion after the Q&A. It will be held from 11:45 to 12:15 in room 3A at 1 Court Street, just a very short walk from the Lebanon Opera House. Our panel this morning consists of Dick Tofel, Brandy Zadrozny, and Joel Simon. Dick Tofel was a founding general manager and first employee of ProPublica, where he served as president from 2013 to 2021. Earlier in his career, he worked 15 years at the Wall Street Journal, ultimately as the assistant publisher. These days, he writes the second Rough Draft newsletter on Substack, consults for publishers and their funders, and teaches a course on the press at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. This is his second visit to the OSHER at Dartmouth stage, having moderated a debate on freedom of the press in 2019. Let us welcome Dick, who will introduce Brandy and Joel, whom he has known for many years.
Thank you, Ann. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be back in New Hampshire, and especially to be back at OSHER at Dartmouth, especially for me, as my uncle, who's here in the second row, helped start this program decades ago, and my cousin Steve is still involved. So it feels like a sort of version of home to me. I also know Barney OSHER a bit, as ProPublica was in many ways the brainchild of his sister and brother-in-law, who became dear friends of mine. Our subject this morning, in the larger context of America's role in preserving peace and prosperity, is disinformation, misinformation, and finding the truth. As I think everyone has come to understand, it is a crucial issue for our society, one that, like so many, seemed to emerge as a focus 8 years ago and remains very much with us today. It's a subject I've personally confronted in a number of roles over that time, as a publisher both seeking to report on these issues and to have readers accept important new investigative reporting, as a columnist observing the effects on the press and the public, and as a teacher in the field of public health communication, where this was such a particular problem in the years 2020 to 2022, and where it remains, of course, a huge challenge. But rather than having me talk to you from my singular view on a subject that is so multifaceted and complicated, the organizers and I thought it would be both more helpful and more interesting if we brought to the party a wider range of perspectives, and I'm delighted at how effectively I think we've been able to do that. My two colleagues here this morning are particularly well suited to join and lead this conversation. Brandy Zadrozny on my right is a senior reporter for NBC News. She covers misinformation, extremism, and the internet. She is a former research fellow at the Technology and Social Change Project at the Harvard Kennedy School's Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy, where I'm on the advisory board, and she is the host of the NBC News podcast, Tiffany Dover is Dead. Joel Simon on my left is the founding director of the Journalism Protection Initiative at the City of New York's Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. From 2006 to 2021, he was the executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. He is the author of 4 books, most recently, The Infodemic: How Censorship and Lies Made the World Sicker and Less Free, co-authored with Rob Mahoney. Please join me in welcoming them both. Thank you. I thought we might begin and focus in the first part of this session a fair amount of our time on a bit of a recent case study, and that is the attempted assassination of the former president. I chose this because in its event I know you're all familiar with, and because I think it's it's fair to say everyone in America immediately had 2 big questions. First, how did this happen? Second, why did it happen? You can look at those questions in big sociological terms, but I mean to pose them in a much narrower, particularistic and situational terms about the narrow event and the shooter. And I think it's a great case study because it's already pretty clear after less than 4 weeks that we will eventually know pretty much everything about precisely how it happened, and we will likely never know why it happened. So in that context of having all the facts soon, and most of them already, and none of the key facts, or almost none on the other side, I think we can learn a lot about how misinformation and disinformation work. So, Brandy, I want to start by asking you to talk about what you've seen in your reporting. Brandy's been doing a lot of reporting on this since the events, which are sort of amazingly, 3 weeks ago, 3.5 weeks ago? It
Certainly
seems like about
years.
7 years. To talk about what you've seen in your reporting about how disinformation and misinformation played a role in these events and in their aftermath.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thank you for having me. I'm so delighted to be here. I was sitting on my couch enjoying I think it was a Sunday afternoon when my phone started blowing up, and I got did you see this? So I opened up my phone, and before I even saw something from the AP or NBC News, I saw people on the internet talking and trying to make sense of what they had seen. And so Kate Starbird at the University of Washington calls this collective sense-making, rumoring. You can call it whatever you want, but people were trying to find out, how could this happen and what did happen? And so what I started doing and what my job is to take what everybody else is looking at and try to explain what we're seeing on the internet. And what I was seeing was that people were trying to make sense of it by looking at all of these different coverage areas. So if you are at all familiar with the JFK assassination, which I assume many of you are, as seniors, then you know that it took a long time before people sort of got to the conspiracy theories that they got to. And I think public polling shows around 50% of people still in America believe some sort of conspiracy theory that there was more than one shooter during the JFK assassination. But this was immediate. immediately, everybody on the internet was talking about there was more than one shooter. Look at the water tower. We had live interviews from people at the scene saying, I saw somebody else. So within a day, we had really the people that make money and get political clout or just internet clout off of sort of lies. We're collectively making hundreds of Zapruder tapes. We're making their own, we're piggybacking off of others to collect and create these conspiracy theories. So by the time I wrote an article on Monday, I had a lot to work with. And what was interesting about this was that it wasn't just from the right, which we've seen the far right. It's become more politically expedient and profitable to trade in conspiracy theories around things like the election or COVID. But this really brought out conspiracy theorists on the left. So we have a couple of competing theories. One is that there was never one was that this is a democratic coup, that they were someone was actually trying, the CIA or the deep state was trying to get rid of Donald Trump. But from the left, we saw a lot of people saying that it was staged, that this was a fake shooting meant to get people to think that he was brave. You had that iconic photo, that this was all staged. So it's interesting times.
And how would you contrast the reaction on these two questions, the one where we really do know the facts, and the one where we really don't know the facts, which are shooters' motivations and what brought him to this point and all of that?
Well, I would suggest that we actually know quite a bit of the facts already, right? That the second question is people not wanting to collectively look at the facts and say, what is the most likely thing that could happen? And so the facts that we know are a loner kid, a young man without many friends, without much of an internet presence, with kind of a community college education, sort of a dead-end job, no girlfriend, did this act of violence. When we look at former attempted assassinations, we see loners, we see people without many prospects, some people wanting to impress Jodie Foster, for instance, or something else, committing these acts of violence for notoriety. We see that happen. I cover school shootings a lot, unfortunately, and that is the type of person we see. When I saw this shooting, I said to my editor, this feels like a school shooting with no school, with school being out. And so, to me, I know who did it. I know how it could happen. Seems a failure of the Secret Service and other, law enforcement. And I think I know why it happened.
Well,
but,
except, here's the one except, right? Which is what we don't know, and it seems we're never going to know, are his politics, if any, right? And so that's the vacuum into which a lot is flowed, right? A lot of people imputing his politics.
For sure. Again, the same thing happens with mass shootings or school shootings. Everybody collectively wants to point at some political ideology, and sometimes we do get that, but oftentimes, a lot of times, this sort of mass violence is more about attention, mental something, the internet, poisoning, a lot of things that go together to create something that makes someone think that this is a good idea and can't be explained in politics. But I think what is important to notice here is that it's so politically helpful to be able to say, look at this side, look at your side, and we have both sides that do that. Your side is violent, your side is dangerous, your side must be stopped.
Yeah. Joel, again, focusing narrowly on this case, what are the things of what Brandy just reported that are broadly indicative? What are they broadly indicative of to you? And what do you make of this as an example of misinformation and disinformation in our society these days?
Well, I think the thing that's reinforced to me is the way in which we operate in two different realms in terms of the information that we consume. Because the efforts that Brandy was describing to kind of make sense, ascribe meaning, put these events into a political context, raise questions. If you were consuming traditional media, it was maybe a period of hours where you had some confusion. It was actually amazing how quickly the news was reported, and how quickly we had reasonably accurate information and context in which to understand and interpret these events. And so, but I think that the people who were using their own kind of resources and their own wits to kind of make sense of these events were operating in a completely different and parallel realm that almost didn't intersect with this other one that I feel that I'm a part of. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and I think this is just particular to this incident, is yes, it's true that we have very good information and reason to believe that a loner, an individual who had, was seeking attention and who had no other motivation, was not particularly political, who didn't have any sophisticated training or support or even an accomplice, managed to come within half an inch of killing the former president and changing American history. Those are the facts. It's inconceivable. It seems impossible. Even though we have all that information, there's this sort of cognitive dissonance. It just seems, even though I have this information, it's hard for me to actually believe it in a way. And I think that's the void where something is inconceivable, where we look for meaning. And that's a process that's, that's ongoing, that, I think Brandy's right at the heart of that, and seeing how that happens in real time. I'm not in that position. But that, to me, is one of the key explanations for why there's so much activity and why there are so many conspiracies and why so many people believe them.
You want to respond to that before I go on?
It's just that I think that's right. Like the search for meaning out of every single event, sometimes things just happen, right? And there are no coincidences on the internet.
Let's back up a bit. How would you each distinguish between misinformation and disinformation? Is it just a question of intent, or is it more than that? You want to take that one first?
All right, I'll set it up. So misinformation and disinformation, two terms that are highly charged at this moment, are wrong things, lies, misperceptions. Misinformation has sort of been used to be the term for lies that are not meant to be spread, right? Rumors. I heard that the COVID vaccine causes infertility in women. I just wanted to let you know. No malintent there. Disinformation is Donald Trump seeding a bunch of lies that the election has somehow been stolen. Everyone knows that's not true. We've been through the courts, it's clear, but it serves a political purpose. So that is disinformation. This is lies spread with an intent to deceive for some purpose, be it monetary, political, whatever. So those are the definitions that I think we've come to appreciate, and frames are really helpful, I think, in describing things. But yeah, the terms themselves, and I'm sure Joel can talk more about it, are pretty charged right now.
Yeah, so Joel, you've written about this, thought about it a lot, including a piece that I commend to you all that was in the New Yorker this past spring, right? Spring? Yep. So what do you make of the distinction? First of all, do you disagree with the distinction
No.
Brandy just made? And even if you don't, what about these terms has come to, what's the importance of these terms from your perspective?
Well, first of all, Brandy, I think, described it and explained it well. So I don't have any disagreement. I have some disagreement with the fact that we use it at all, or the fact that we use it so much. And let me first explain, the primary reason I feel this way is because my role for many years was to defend press freedom and the rights of journalists around the world, particularly in places where journalists are facing censorship and repression and violence. And I've seen that this term disinformation has been weaponized by autocratic leaders around the world who basically use it to define, for them it just means, what my opponents say. That's disinformation, and then if disinformation is bad, then I have a perfect framework to repress the speech of my opponents. And this has been weaponized around the world, and that deeply troubles me, and I think that the over-reliance on the term has made it easier for autocratic leaders to do that. But more broadly, I think that it's not particularly helpful or clarifying. We become very dependent on it, and maybe, Brandy, you and I will have a conversation about this. I mean, the original understanding of what it meant, it was a term that was developed, in basically post-revolutionary Russia to refer to what are called active measures. So, efforts by governments to sort of weaponize rumors in ways that advance their strategic interests. That was the initial kind of understanding of what disinformation was. And really, only about a decade ago, there's like a form, it's just a kind of a group of academic researchers who started popularizing it and making these distinctions between disinformation, which is essentially deliberate, and misinformation, which is rumors and accidental people spreading lies that they believe to be true because they believe them. I think so. It's a question of intent, but it really gets muddled. Look at let's look at the assassination attempt. If I am there and I see something and I interpret it in a way that is incorrect and I post that online, that's misinformation because I believe it. But if I'm Trump and I take that same bit of information and start amplifying it in a way that advances my political ends and I know it to be incorrect, that becomes disinformation. And if I'm the Russian government and I'm saying, this is rumors that have sort of formed organically, but I'm going to amplify them as a way to undermine democracy, which the Russians do every day, and most of the time it's not successful, that's also disinformation. And I'm just wondering if by describing it in this way and writing about it in this way, we're actually not informing, this is me speaking as a journalist, not really clarifying and informing this complex phenomenon for our readers. Are we too reliant on jargon? This is a real phenomenon. By the way, I'm not disagreeing with this as a phenomenon. I'm just wondering if there's a better and clearer and less jargony way of explaining what's happening.
Thoughts?
I have many. I think it would be helpful just to set out a little timeline first, too, because here's what happened. About 8-ish years ago, there were a couple of researchers around the country that were doing this work already. Mostly, they started around the Boston bombing, people noticing, like, the internet's becoming this thing where people go to make sense of things that they're seeing in real time, and often that collective sense-making is wrong. Those rumors, like we saw with the Boston bombing, were wrong, right? Innocent people got swept up. It causes real harm. So this research was quietly going on. And then Donald Trump came, and the internet came, and we had all of these things happening at once. And so you could call it propaganda. We could have gone for Renee DiResta likes amplifaganda, which is a little bit mouthy, but you get the point. The word didn't quite matter, but it was the fact that, and then a couple of journalists came along, I was one of them, that said, we should start sounding the alarm that these lies are being spread and amplified with social media. We should, sound this alarm. So we did. And then, as happens in journalism, topics get kind of hot, right? It becomes like a sexy topic, and somehow misinformation and disinformation became that. And then as the years went by, suddenly there was the ex-Prince of England and his lovely wife Meghan were heading a team combating disinformation somehow, and every university had a center battling misinformation, and it got a little much. It did. It got a little much, so much that I was like, we can't, the time to sound the alarm is over, actually. We can't keep saying, there's lots of misinformation on Twitter. Well, yeah, we know, right? Like, that's not new information, and it's not helping anybody. But everybody was still doing that. And so the field became crowded, the word became overused, and just like with fake news, it became co-opted. My issue is that it seems like everyone, including, Jim Jordan and this weaponization of social media committee, are going back and journalists who I appreciate who are writing these articles saying, we shouldn't use misinformation and disinformation, you're not included, are kind of pointing back to the original researchers and the original journalists who were doing something new and saying, this is all your fault. This is a bad term that you made and you shouldn't use it anymore and stop it. And so I guess I feel like we're missing so much of the timeline, that the beginning was good and important, and now everyone's like, we're tired of misinformation. Like, me too.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an important discussion. I mean, look, it's been weaponized, obviously, by autocratic leaders. So that's my primary concern. That's the entry point. When I start seeing laws being passed around the world against misinformation, I think something's off the rails. And it's also obviously been politicized and weaponized in this country. And this is, the modus operandi. If you say, Trump is a threat to democracy, he'll say you're a threat to democracy. If you say he's corrupt, he'll say you're corrupt. If you say that your talking points are misinformation, he'll say your talking points are misinformation. So, that's just a Trump dynamic that's unavoidable. I do think it was useful. I do think it's important as a concept, and I do think, but I think that the challenge for us as journalists now, I don't think we can abandon the term. The term has been, it has meaning, it has value as a framing for academic research, but I just think we should, and I'm sure you're doing this, and I'm sure many other people who are on this beat are doing this. I think every time we use it, we just have to ask ourselves, is there a better word? A lot of the old words actually did the work and are more, and also there's a whole jumble of motivations and actions in this space. Like I said, some people may be spreading lies and rumors because they believe them. Some people may be spreading them because they're fun and they're exciting. Some people may be doing it to win elections. Some people may be doing it to, destroy democracy. So there's a hierarchy of action, and I think calling it all misinformation and disinformation and implying that these are sort of, really related concepts in some instances actually doesn't inform understanding, it undermines it. So that's my critique.
And I will just say, I think we agree here. I think we have a tendency as journalists and as people who care about words and their meanings to sort of navel gaze a bit and how have I contributed to this thing, instead of, they're still doing disinformation. You can call me a liar all you want, or you can say that I'm actually the disinformer, but you're still doing it, and I'm going to continue, and I'm not going to give up that phrase or that frame so easily.
I do think we have a rough consensus on the definition of terms. So I guess the next question I want to ask both of you is, in this society at this moment, in your view, is misinformation or disinformation a bigger problem?
I think it depends. I started actually not working with, I did a lot of work in health misinformation, so I wrote a lot about women and women's health and how we moved and searched on the internet because, the medical system isn't so great with women, especially in this country. Maternal care is abysmal, infant death is ridiculous. So why did women start using the internet? And when they did start using the internet, instead of having reliable access to healthcare, kind of dangerous situations happened. It wasn't always a good thing. Then COVID happened, and we saw what well-meaning rumors could do and the danger that could present itself from those rumors. Lots of people needlessly died. So in terms of what's more dangerous, I think misinformation can be really dangerous. I have no idea how to combat that. I don't think that I don't know that labeling works. I don't know that fact checks always work. I don't know that de-amplifying that. I don't know. I think so dangerous, yes. I think with disinformation, there's a lot more we could do about it, and it presents its own unique dangers.
Joel?
I think I'm going to just defer to Brandy in terms of the local context, and if you don't mind, just pull back and talk about it as a global phenomenon and try to answer it that way. And there, I think they're both, it's in some ways, they're both tremendous threats. Are people misinformed, right? Or are they being misled? That's really what you're asking, right?
Right.
And obviously they're related. But I think just as someone who's devoted my career to defending the rights of journalists, I see disinformation, active efforts by governments and autocratic leaders and populist leaders to hijack power based on deliberate lies to be the existential threat. And I'm just looking at it in a global context. People have always been misinformed. They've always made, they haven't had access to the full range of information they need to make informed decisions. In some ways, that's gotten worse because of the technology, but in some ways, people have access to more information than they've ever had access to. So there's sort of competing dynamics there. But the ability of bad actors to shape perceptions and weaponize information to achieve and maintain power, that's, to me, the kind of the larger threat and the existential threat.
Is there anything you want to say before I move on a minute?
No.
Okay. I want to bring in a little bit of a second case. We've talked a lot about the internet, and we've talked about how this has become a bigger problem in the last 8 or 9 years. But even if that's true, I want to acknowledge it's not an entirely new problem. A few years ago in the Columbia Journalism Review, I wrote a piece about a famous piece of misinformation, which actually, take my word for it, because I've studied it, started as disinformation about an incident involving Paul McCartney that is sort of summed up in the phrase, "Paul is dead." Given the audience, I suspect this is at least somewhat familiar to many of you. How many of you remember the "Paul is dead" moment from October of 1969? It's a little hard to see out into the audience, but a fair number. Just to minimize the frustration for the rest of you, here's a quick summary. In October 1969, the Western world was swept by a story that Paul McCartney, who, as you all know, I hope is alive and well and still performing in his 80s, had died in an automobile accident 3 years earlier, been secretly replaced by a double chosen in a look-alike contest, and that clues to this were strewn throughout recent Beatles albums. Trust me, that really happened, and in October of 1969, there was 2 or 3 days where almost everyone in America was talking about this. It led the evening news, actually on NBC, for 3 nights in a row. It's a wild story and worth, if you don't remember it, or even if you do but would love to get back up to speed, Googling when you have some time. In any event, the question I want to ask you both is how much of this is really a new problem? And what, if anything, is most important about what's changed?
Not to plug my own stuff, but in Tiffany Dover's Dead, episode 2, we actually do a whole piece on the Paul is dead rumor. And it's so wild. And I think what it says is, and why we did it, is that collective sense-making, rumoring, conspiracy theorizing about popular topics and topics that we care about it's been around as long as people have been around, right? Like, it is something we will always do because we are storytellers, we are creative animals, and that is just something I feel like that is in our bones. What is different now is, I think with Paul is Dead, that started on the radio, right? It was somebody called into a radio DJ and said, I heard that Paul is dead. This radio DJ had 3 hours to fill, and so he said, keep on talking. And so they started rumoring this up, and he said, and then somebody else called and said, yeah, if you play it backwards, it says Paul is dead, Paul is dead. And so he started playing it backwards on the air, and then it spread to other radio stations.
And then some kids, just to fill you, the rest of you in, sat in a University of Michigan dorm room and got really stoned and made up about 20 different factoids. They just completely made them up about why this might be true and how you might know.
And isn't that fun? And so right there with that example, we have participatory misinformation happening, collecting, and we have it for lots of different reasons. Just for fun, we call it LOLs now on the internet. Some person doing it for media, right? That would be your Alex Jones. Like that, the systems are the same. The thing that is different is the speed and the reach. It happens so fast now. Like these conspiracy theories happen so quickly. And unfortunately, what's also happened because of the democratization of information and the internet is it's been the democratization of the people who are harmed. So we're not talking about Paul McCartney, who is living his life in Scotland, like on this beautiful farm with his wife and new child. We're talking about a nurse in Chattanooga, Tennessee, who crazy people are going now to her home. We're talking about election workers in Georgia, who crazy people are now knocking on their door, making them fear for their lives. It's become such a problem, I think, and become so much worse because of the internet.
Joel?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the reality. I mean, information and the narratives we tell is how we make sense of our lives and how we form communities, and it's why when people believe things that some others of us believe to be untrue, and they're part of a community of people who believe that same thing, you can't engage them with logic, because if they were to abandon those beliefs, they would be no longer a member of this community. And so these kinds of belief systems become deeply ingrained, and the notion that we can just fight, disinformation with compelling people to, kind of engage with reason and logic is just misguided. And I think that there was it was a little bit before my time, but I think that what that Paul is dead rumor did was it kind of created a community. It was a community that was totally tongue-in-cheek, but everyone was kind of a Beatles fan, so you could sort of be a part of this. And there was a kind of way in which people could, kind of also, they would believe it, but they would also, like as you say in your piece, they wouldn't act on it. They knew that they were participating in a kind of collective fun. It was a fun exercise that was sort of fun and enjoyable and a way of creating community, but it also explains why, and I think this is the trap that we also often fall into, is why we can't combat this problem simply with logic and reason.
Yeah, so I want to pursue that for a second, because we've talked a little bit in this example, and it's come up once or twice earlier, about how this is fun for people in a sense. And the most interesting thing to me, actually, when I spent a week or two, or maybe even 3, thinking about Paul is dead, was talking to my wife, who is also here, and she was in, she was 13 years old, so whatever grade that puts you in, and this was a big thing in her 13-year-old class, and many of them, most of them, I think, really believed for 2 or 3 days, and maybe longer, that Paul was dead, but they didn't react the way they would have really reacted if Paul had really died, right? And this was the thing that happened all across the country. There were no people weeping in public. There was no people running to lay flowers down. So it was a little bit of a game, right? How much of that is true for our misinformation problem generally? And what does it say about this debate we've been having, again, for 8 years, about taking things seriously and taking them literally?
Naomi Klein has this, did I get the right one? Yes. Has this book, Doppelganger, and she talks about these not being serious people, but you have to take them seriously, right? And so I think about that frame a lot. But what I think your question is also getting at is what you were saying, Joel, about this is an identity in some way, right? So if your wife's identity was a schoolmate and Beatles fan, and this was a sort of thing that people were sharing in, that becomes a community identity thing. And so when I see disinformation being spread and misinformation being shared, it's often in that person's role as what they identify with in their community. Like, I am a mother, I am a mama bear on Instagram, and I will not give my children vaccines. And I, have this filtered water. And I buy into all the stuff that these creators say that I must, because that is my community. It's hard to say how much people believe and how much they don't. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but I often will get in cabs with people, and I'll chat about, and I'll bring up conspiracy theories, or what do you think about this? And a lot of people believe a lot of conspiracy theories, and a lot of people trade in misinformation, especially around the election and COVID. And sometimes I have had experiences where people have been like, I don't know if it's really true though. But like, they're very invested in it, and online they're trading in it, they're sharing it, but like, there's a bit where they're like, who knows? And so it is fun, and I think it's hard to determine one person's fun is another person's danger.
Yeah, Joel?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, these kinds of belief systems are a bit like superstitions. Superstitions can be really powerful. If you just to use some sort of, baseball analogy, since we've been talking about baseball, like it's a sport where, like, if somebody gets on a hitting streak, they believe that it's because of, whatever, some random...
The cap they're wearing, or whatever.
Yeah, the cap, whatever. And if you tell them, like, that's not why you're, on a hitting streak, stop doing that, they'll be like, no way, there's no way I'm going to stop doing that. That's absolutely integral to the success that I'm having. Or this thing is bad luck. So, it's a bit like the way, like, I think we kind of, as human beings, our relationship to superstition. If you actually pushed us, we would acknowledge it's just a superstition. But it has a powerful hold on us, and it actually determines our behavior in profound ways. But we are sophisticated enough at the end of the day to also recognize that, that maybe there is no relationship, but we're just not going to risk it.
And I think in these online communities, at least, I don't know if your wife, for example, were to be like, Paul's not dead, you get the pile-on, right? You would be the subject of ridicule, or people would, pile, and you get that on the internet too. Again, I'm in all of these like crunchy mama groups. I'm kind of a crunchy person. But if you dare dissent, you are booted out of the group or piled on. And so to say, I don't know if I believe that, or are you sure? That's just, welcome to your own funeral on the internet. It's over. So I think that's part of the reason, too, that people don't dare.
Just before we break, I want to retreat from this and ask a philosophical discussion and ask a couple of just very practical questions that may help us, and we may end up with more of these in the questions and after the break. And that is the relationship between journalists and misinformation and disinformation. How good are they these days, do you think, at recognizing it? Are their skills improving or not? And are these problems different at the national as opposed to the local levels?
Joel, you want to go first? I'm curious.
Yeah, look, this is just my observation. A lot of the criticism of journalists from, whatever, people who have a kind of, usually some sort of ideological agenda that what you're reporting is disinformation or misinformation, is completely disingenuous. And it's just a sort of framework that I think to some ways we've provided to them, in which that they turn back against us to critique the work that we do. The kind of, rumors and, government manipulation that is the primary threat. I think journalists are pretty good at weeding it out. There are certainly many mistakes that journalists have made that we could point to, but I don't think that's the fundamental dynamic. I think the fundamental dynamic is that when you're talking about like traditional mainstream media, is that like a large segment of the public just doesn't believe it and doesn't trust it, and that there are powerful forces that are seeking to, undermine and disrupt that relationship in order to gain political advantage, and that's happening both domestically and all over the world. So I mean, there's certainly examples you can point to, and if we wanted to go down that exercise where journalists have reported things that have been false or they've been manipulated. But I don't think that that misinformation is the way we've been talking about it, or disinformation, that journalists itself are the fundamental driver. I think there's a kind of separate information system that is reaching people who are disengaged from the mainstream press, and they're the ones who are kind of driving and amplifying this kind of way of seeing the world.
Yeah, I mean, for some portion of the population, no matter what, it doesn't matter what I write, right? As long as it's under NBC News, it's going to be fake news. They're not going to believe it. And that's a real issue and a real problem. I think that is part of, when you're misinformed and you refuse to trust, reliable news sources, and reliable news sources start to lose journalists, and that pollutes the information environment in a way where misinformation and disinformation can thrive. I do trainings for my newsroom sometimes and for students, and I say that I never went to journalism school. I was a librarian and an English teacher, so I learned how to research on the internet really, really well, and so that is how I became a reporter of lots of subjects, politics and health, through that research lens. And so when I train people now, I say, we're all disinformation reporters. All of us are, because of the internet and the way that it's set up and how people's information environments are, it is your task now not only to report on something that somebody says, but also do the work to find out and explain the context around something that may be a lie.
The last thing before we take the break, what's the best advice for experts and journalists these days in coping with misinformation and disinformation? Do you risk amplifying it when debunking it? Do you ignore it? I gather your answer to that is clearly no. How useful is this idea of pre-bunking, of trying to get ahead of it and saying people will say X, but?
As far as I know, I like my job. I would like to keep it. So I think that we should continue this as a journalistic practice. And I do think, again, instead of saying alarm, alarm, there is misinformation, I think that there is real value in explaining the pipeline of and who profits and how misinformation and disinformation gets to you, and debunking that in an article or a television program or something. I think what is less helpful is seeing misinformation everywhere and saying and having every journalist say, beware all the time, because what that does is it creates this environment, which is sometimes the end result of disinformation and the intended end result, where people say, I don't know what to believe anymore. From research standpoint, it's really the jury is still out. Whether fact checks work, there's competing research. Some people says it does. Some people says it doesn't. Some people say that misinformation doesn't actually have any effect on people and their voting or their politicization. And some research says that it does. So I think this is so new, and it's something that we forget about. It's been 8 years, which in this environment feels like a lifetime. But this is actually an incredibly new thing that we're dealing with on the internet and with social, and so we're just starting to get our head around it. I wouldn't know what the best thing to do is.
I think that there's obviously no simple solution. I don't think, and it's also a phenomenon that's been around forever, as we've discussed. It has to do with who we are as human beings. It has to be with how we form groups and how we build identity, and so it's not like there's some solution, quote unquote, to this problem, quote unquote. I don't think, first of all, that journalists should internalize that our role is, quote unquote, combating disinformation. I think our job is doing journalism and informing people, and hopefully if we do that well and we have credibility, then people tend to will be more likely to read and engage and believe what we produce. Although, for the reasons I just described, that's never going to be 100%. The one tactic that I think has worked well is actually, and I think this is an evolution, so I want to point to two examples. One was when, and it sort of will take us back full circle, when Putin, Vladimir Putin, was amassing troops on the border of Ukraine and lying about what he was doing, trying to hide his intentions. The US intelligence community was authorized by President Biden to release a level of intelligence that they wouldn't normally release, to make clear that this was untrue and that an invasion was imminent and that it was being planned. And when that, I think that did shift the kind of perception of those events. Not 100%, but enough that, in a way that was significant. And the other thing, I think this will take us back full circle. You know, you were comparing, what happened with the Kennedy assassination to what happened on, the recent assassination attempt against President Trump. And I think that the government, a variety of different agencies in a variety of different contexts, got the information out incredibly quickly. Think how long it took, with Kennedy, right? You had the Warren Committee, it was like an endless process. And while there's plenty of conspiracies, there's plenty of misinformation, there's plenty of people who are weaponizing that misinformation to political purposes. But I think that's just observationally, we need to do more research. That's the thing that works. And the onus is really on governments to adapt to this new information environment and, get information out quickly and transparently in ways that are credible. And if media, views that information with skepticism, but also, a kind of willingness to kind of engage with it and report it, then, that can reach a broader audience. And I think, certainly at the margins, that's meaningful.
I mean, as a journalist, yes, more information from government sources at the moment that we need it would be very welcome and helpful to combating this, because misinformation loves a vacuum, right? When there's no information, people will naturally try to fill in the holes.
Okay. Anne, is Anne around someplace? Oh, there she is. Is this a good time to take a break, Anne? And do you want to give people some instructions about that?
Thank you very much to our panelists. It's been a very informative hour. And we will now take a break. I've got not quite 5 of, so 25 after 10, please be back in your seats. The basket for questions, there's one in the back, but we're missing one this morning here in the front. So just lay them on the front of the stage and we will collect them and expect our panel to be sharp and ready for all your questions. Thanks.
Okay, I think we're going to get started. First of all, thank you all for quite a pile of questions, and some really terrific ones, which we're going to enjoy answering over the next hour. Let me start with this one for both of you. I'm going to read three because I think they're all trying to make sort of the same point. And that is, how can people most effectively behave as consumers? The first one is, how can you be an informed voter? How do you find the truth? The second says, as consumers of news, how can we evaluate the reliability and veracity of government sources? And the third says, how can the average citizen distinguish between disinformation, misinformation, and accurate information? So, thoughts?
Do you want to take that one first? Oh, okay. Okay, I was hoping you would. Look, I mean, I think that basically the kind of things that journalists used to do professionally, you know, have the systems of information that we have made possible the democratization of journalism, if you will. Anyone, you know, we have access to such incredible amounts of information that were once only available to, you know, a much smaller segment of the population, that, you know, we delegated to journalists the responsibility of, you know, evaluating sources of information and making determinations about what was accurate. And sometimes they did this well, and sometimes they did it poorly. Sometimes they, as we know, you know, didn't consider the perspective of communities that were marginalized. There's lots of criticism of the way journalists approach this task, but we you know, it was something that really was so time-consuming and difficult that we had to have institutions and professionals kind of do this for us. And now we have the opportunity to do it for ourselves. You know, anyone can probably find, you know, most of the information, I'm going to bet that you work with, Brandy, is probably available to the general public, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So the question is, you know, first question is, do you have the time? Do you have the inclination? Do you have the, like, natural skepticism, the kinds of traits that, you know, would make you do a good job if you were trying to make your own determinations? And, but really, it comes down to, is there somebody else you trust to do this work on your behalf? Because it's incredibly time-consuming and difficult. And so ideally, you know, the answer is yes. You know, ideally is, you know, you you know, the only other point I'll make about this is, like, if there's some level of, like, I believe that whatever journalistic institution is the one that aligns with, you know, my sort of outlook and approach to the world, is making an honest and deliberate and sincere and effort to determine the truth on my behalf. And I trust them to go through this process and present to me this information, and even better, where possible, you know, they're going to give me there's going to be enough transparency that I can spot check it. I can go back and look at it, you know, I'm not going to do this every day, but when I go back and I look at their sources, I really feel validated that these people are doing this work in a professional manner. And I think that's the best way to be an informed consumer and voter. And it's kind of up to journalists to kind of sell their product in a way that's compelling. I don't think, you know, the kind of, I'll do my own research is going to, I mean, it's possible, and some people, you know, are like closet journalists and are actually really good at this, but the majority of people, when they do their own research, are going to come out with, they're going to be less informed than if they trust journalists to do this work for them.
My heart's actually beating right now, just because that phrase, do your own research, is just so terrifying to me, because it undergirds so much of misinformers' work, really. And I think It is kind of easy to do my job, don't tell anybody, but like I'm skeptical, not cynical, and I like to find out who's telling me something. I'm just curious, like where does this information come from? And I will Google a lot, I read what people write, I read newspaper articles about people that are in my beat, and I get to sort of figure out who these people are that are giving me this information. So I cover presidential candidate, yikes, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as a part of my beat, and have for a decade now because I covered the anti-vaccination movement for a long time. And, you know, he is really good at, he once, this was, I think like 10 years ago, he wanted to submit an essay to the Daily Beast where I worked at one point, and this essay was, "I'm not an anti-vaxxer." And he wrote this very long essay, and it had so many footnotes that, you know, you could go and read each one of these studies, and it was like, it seemed to suggest and seemed to support his suggestion that vaccines caused autism, which we don't have any evidence for, and most of the evidence, 99.9% of the evidence we do suggests that that's not a thing that's happened. But he wrote this essay, and as I'm reading, and I start to look into the sources that he's citing, and I'm like, I'm not equipped to read this medical journal and decide if he's right on the science. So I call the scientist up, right, who wrote this journal that he's citing, and I say, hey, did he get this right? And the scientist said, one, absolutely not. He did not get that right. It's absolutely wrong. He's reaching the wrong conclusions from the science. But number two, you cannot put my name anywhere because I am terrified of him and the anti-vaxxers that will come for me if you dare go against him in public. And so all of that is to say, I don't think you have to do that level of research on every single thing that you read, but you can do something, and it's consider the source, right? You can take a minute and say, is this information that I'm reading about coming from law enforcement and a single source only? Well, then maybe I'll believe that and maybe I won't. Is it coming, you know, just from a presidential candidate? What might they have to gain if I believe this, and how might that not be true? And then, you know, you don't have to sort of war it out with everybody on the internet and everybody on your Facebook profile, whether that's true or not. But I do think one more thing that you can do that I've really been inspired by lately is that there are sort of these quiet warriors I like to think about on the internet who, for example, who will speak up, who will dare go against the hive mind and say gently and kindly in their communities that are real communities, maybe that's not true. We should look at that and start a nice conversation about facts and what they are and what we know and what we don't. For example, there was I'm working on this story about Russian disinformation campaigns on the internet, which most of them fail horribly, but someone from an Indiana Republican group was sharing one of these false narratives, these fake stories being spread by Russian firms linked to the Kremlin. And she shared this and said, "Can you believe it? You know, Ukraine is stealing all our money and buying yachts." And someone that was a part of her club said, "I don't know if that's true, and let's think about it before we post it," but very gently. And then there was a conversation that happened, and they came collectively to the conclusion that it probably wasn't true, and no one was harmed. And I love that sort of kind sense-making. I think it's really helpful, so do that.
And the other thing that I would just add, and you're both welcome to react, is for things that challenge your own view, or things that you're inclined to disagree with, make sure you understand why you disagree and what your basis is for disagreeing. For instance, you know, the polls make very clear, we've just in some ways had an interesting experiment with the capacity of our current president to do his job, which was that after we watched the debate, literally a third of the country changed its mind on that question. And maybe they were wrong in the first place, or maybe they were wrong in the second place. But one thing that I think we can be sure about is the third of the country that changed their minds were underinformed, maybe not at all their fault, before the event, right? It was true a year ago that if you ask people to name, and because people did this, if you ask people to name one word that they associated with the President of the United States, the word was overwhelmingly old. That was a year ago. And yet the polls showed that this was having almost no effect on the election, or maybe a slow eroding effect, but very slow and fairly modest. And then the debate, and it had an enormous effect. So the question is why, and the answer might be you didn't know enough about how the president was doing his job, because you don't spend very much time with the president, and you see him only the half hour a day that they present him to you, and what if it turns out that he only has 2 good hours a day? So whether you agree on the specifics of that or not is not my point. My point is, if a lot of people think something and you think they're wrong, it's worth, I think, examining with yourself, why do they think that, and why do I think they're wrong? And do I really have a basis for thinking they're wrong? Now, you may be right. A lot of people, for instance, share Bobby Kennedy's views about vaccines, and they shouldn't. But there are reasons, you need to satisfy yourself that that is the case.
I've heard people on stages with me before, that what is truth, right? Like, how can we really know? And I think that we can interrogate ourselves and interrogate our information and our biases, and then come to a pretty close approximation of what the truth is. I think that can be discerned almost in every case. And tensions, like I was saying before, a little dialed down and in pursuit of honest, rational, calm truth.
I mean, we were talking about this in the break. I'm not sure I totally agree with that framing. I don't think the truth is necessarily no. I mean, in some instances, it certainly is, and I think that it objectively exists. But I think that really, as journalists and as people whose role it is to serve democracy and the public, really people have to, it's really in the kind of information space, it's about who is making an honest effort to discern the truth to the best of their ability and who is not. That's really what we're talking about. And journalists should be making every effort to discern the truth. And they may get it wrong, but it's about, and does the public trust us to perform that role? And when you talk about misinformation and disinformation, what you're talking about is people who are active in the information space who are not doing that. They're either not doing that because they have another agenda and because they want to manipulate the truth to achieve some political or strategic advantage, or they're not doing that because they're not willing to put in the work. They just are willing to believe stuff, and it's hard to do it. That's why hopefully journalism has value. So I don't really think of, like, are we able to discern the truth? I think about it as, do we have the tools, resources, knowledge, institutional support to engage in this activity in a way that is honest and credible? And does our audience believe that that's what we are doing?
And I agree. And the indicator that sort of makes my ears always perk up is whenever I read or hear a journalist saying, here's what we don't know still, right? And I instantly trust someone who tells me these are the unknowns and these are the knowns, and here's what we're working on, and here are the ways that we're doing it. And I think, I forget who said this, it's not me, maybe Brooke Gladstone from On the Media, but transparency is the new objectivity, is what she said. And I love that. It's just being totally open and honest and transparent in every kind of way. And the opposite is also true. Whenever I hear a so-called journalist, whether they write for sort of a propaganda publication or whether it's Robert F. Kennedy Jr., say, I have all the answers, I know everything, and this is what, that's immediately like, I know that person's not, I can't trust that person, and it's not a credible source for news for me.
Next question is, I've been attributing the dramatic rise of misinformation and disinformation to a lack of education. Can you comment? You used to be a teacher?
I will always be a teacher and always be a librarian. It's hard. There's a big, this is a new problem. Many solutions have been raised. One of the big ones is media literacy. We need more media literacy, more librarians, which again, job security, I love. But is that really the answer? And I just sort of think, again, that this has been a thing that we humans have always done. And I think that there is good work to be done in teaching people how to use the internet and how to search Google better and how to, some people have this thing called SIFT where you can find information and work backwards, research skills. I think that that's all very helpful. I use that in my daily life and would suggest everyone too. But I don't know that a particular media literacy class is going to solve this, whether it's for, seniors in libraries, or we start it with elementary school kids, which is what some people are doing. I just don't know. I don't know.
Well, I mean, again, so if we believe the sort of proximate cause of this is like, communities of belief, communities that have belief structures that are reinforced, then, like media literacy is not necessarily going to solve it. On the other hand, I happen to think it's good. I mean, I just think like, yes, this should be part of every education. I don't think we have to have a perfect, the research is clearly limited and inconclusive, but I don't know if that's a bar that we need to, kind of attain. In other words, what is the impact of educating people more effectively about how systems of information work, how the media works, how technology helps, sift and sort information, how to evaluate. I think those are useful skills. I have no idea whether, if we kind of see this as a solution to the problems we've been discussing today, whether it'll make an impact, but I think it's a kind of, it's good practice.
And there is some research, and everything's new, but there is some research to suggest that if you were doing sort of education to fix this problem, that a more general, like how to use the internet, how to research, how to find sources, stuff like that, is probably better than a class titled Misinformation and Shielding Yourself from It, because that creates this sort of, the research suggests, that it creates this thing where you sort of see misinformation everywhere, where you don't trust any sources, where you don't know where to look, where you kind of give up, and then it creates this thing called the danger of something called the liar's dividend, which is this bonus, I guess, that disinformers sort of gain for an information environment that's so polluted that people will just believe that everything's a lie or that they can't believe anything.
Next question, how often are journalists, scammed by misinformation, like, say, Dan Rather reporting on Bush's National Guard record?
So we have a Slack room. Journalists, I have a very large newsroom with hundreds of journalists, and we have a Slack room where we engage.
First of all, do people know what Slack is?
Sorry, it's a.
I suspect not. Right.
Thank you. It's a social media. It's a platform used for work where we basically all meet in a room, but on the internet. So we talk in there. I say, hey Joel, did you see about this thing? I can private message someone, but we share ideas. And often we will share things that turn out to be not true, right? Misinformation. And we do our collective sense making, and we do use journalism to sort of solve that problem, hopefully before it ever reaches the end product, which is, broadcast or the internet. Sometimes I think things that are labeled misinformation now have been broadcast on our air or have, reached the internet about maybe COVID protocols, things that we know now not to be, that we were sort of working out at the time, that we maybe reported as a little too sure of. But I think, again, if you just think of misinformation as wrong information, half of what I do is look into something that turns out to be wrong. That's the work of journalism, is to find out what's true and what's not, and hopefully not promote the things that aren't.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is, journalism is a flawed institution. It's always been the case. There's always been stories that have been reported that have been inaccurate. Mistakes have always been made. There have always been institutional failures. This is the nature of a complex undertaking that's, where one of the, and I'm not talking specifically about the Dan Rather incident, but one of the obligations is to report things as quickly as you possibly can. So that is going to create an environment in which mistakes happen. And I don't think this is the right place to get into this, but of course there's a broader critique of journalism as an institution, and there are questions about. I think the fundamental question is about who is represented within the journalism that we do. What voices do we prioritize? What communities and perspectives do we present as credible? We make judgments about that all the time, and I think if you look at the history of journalism, that's actually our greatest failure. Not the mistakes, those have happened, but the kind of failure historically to be as fully inclusive as we should have been. And I actually think journalism institutionally is doing better at that. But then the question then becomes, when we fail as journalists, what are those failures weaponized to undermine and discredit the whole undertaking? And that's what I really am concerned about. And I see that happening. I see a lot of people who are not saying, this was a mistake or this was a terrible mistake, and what are the institutional strategies we need to use to ensure that this never happens again, but who say that journalism is fundamentally corrupt, or journalism is institutionally incapable of fulfilling its role. That to me is what I worry about, and I see that happening. I'm sure you just feel, Brandy, in your role, that like any mistake that you make, it's not that people will say, you should be held accountable for any mistake you make. I mean, we all agree on that. But that it'll be used to undermine the entire undertaking, the work of your colleagues, the institution, so that we're under even greater pressure now because of that dynamic.
Yeah, I just want to say about this particular example, I thought it was worth surfacing this. This question, this happened 20 years ago. And Dan Rather lost what in some ways was probably the single highest, almost certainly the single highest paid job in journalism. Also probably the best known job in journalism, because he fell victim, for reasons we can all speculate about, to actually disinformation, and made a really big mistake. That does not happen very often, for precisely the reason that Brandy was talking about. And when it does, you tend to hear about it in a pretty big way, because one of the things about journalism is that it is enormously self-involved, as I guess many industries are, but then it has a big platform, and so its self-involvement tends to get shared not only in the inside the house, but with the whole world. So, when the New York Times has a fabulist, which also happened more than 20 years ago, it gets exposed pretty quickly and then rehashed on and on and on, and the bosses get fired and all of that. Those things happen, and they're not great by any means, and I don't mean to excuse them in any way, but the fact that you know about them and the fact that they're almost all associated with very powerful people losing their jobs ought to in some way give you comfort. And the flip side of that, I think, is correction columns, for the same reason that Brandy was suggesting, correction columns and the acknowledgments of mistakes, which Joel was also pointing out, you ought to take comfort in that. It's places that don't have correction columns that I think you ought to worry about more. I personally have thought that one of the very serious mistakes that was made in the construction of the television evening news, which obviously is still a way that 20 million people get news every day, the network evening news, they basically never run corrections. Do not kid yourself. It's not that they never make mistakes. It's that somebody decided 60 years ago that in this tight format where we only have 20-something minutes a night, we're simply never going to admit mistakes unless they're enormous, right? Just garden variety mistakes. We're just not going to do it. We're going to pretend it didn't happen. That was a fundamental mistake, I think.
Yes, but I will say that around 20 years ago was also sort of the birth of the standards department inside television news organizations. So, and I think people knowing more about how hard it is to get a story on television or on the internet is really, really important. Like, I will tell my mom, I'm working on this crazy story, and then a week and a half later, she'll be like, well, where's the story? I'm like, oh, it's with the standards. She's like, what standard? I'm like, well, my story is edited by an editor, and then it goes through a fact check, and then it goes through another editor, which is usually like the specialty editor. If it's a tech story or a medical story, it'll go through that editor. Then it goes through my executive editor. And then if he thinks everything is okay, then it goes through our standards department. And then I have a standards editor who basically looks at every word and says, is this fair to everybody here? Did you call everybody you mentioned? Are you sure when you say this, do we mean some or all? Like, picks every word apart. And then it goes to the legal department who says, can anybody sue us for this? Is this fair to everybody? Like, does this, is this, yeah. And so it goes through all of those things, and then it goes on the internet. So much so that I can't even look at it anymore by the time it goes up because I'm so tired of looking at this thing. So there are so many checks and balances. And even with all of those things, we will still make mistakes because we are people, but that's where, yeah, corrections, they are so important. And if I have a story, this hasn't happened yet, but it probably will, that's on television that is wrong, that's when I will go on, not Twitter anymore, but I will go on Threads or something on the internet and say, this was a mistake, and I got this wrong.
So I've then got a couple of related questions. The first one is, how are proven liars and propagandists able to maintain audiences and credibility? Alex Jones, for instance. And then how do news outlets with clear political agendas, such as Fox and MSNBC, contribute to distrust?
Are you looking at me?
Either one of you.
Do you want to do the first one?
I'll do the first one,
okay.
you do the second. Oh, okay.
Okay.
So, well, if you've ever watched Alex Jones's show, it is very entertaining. I am a Rush Limbaugh girl. I listen to Rush Limbaugh in my dad's truck every day on my way to school, when he was at work. These people are highly entertaining, if that's your thing, which for millions of Americans, that is their thing. They like the sort of mistrust of government. They think this sort of snide humor and constant sarcasm and bombasticness of Alex Jones is entertainment. And so that is the answer to that. It is wildly entertaining stuff, and for people with a certain worldview, it makes them feel heard and understood and not crazy and right, and it is their community. And so it's incredibly, incredibly powerful. The question to me is not like, how do these people have an audience? It's how does anybody leave that community? How do you strip yourself away from that engaging stuff?
Yeah. I mean, I think that I was going to make a point about it's first of all, yes, it's absolutely entertaining, and I think that I'm sorry, I lost my thread there. So the second question was on
how do news outlets with clear political agendas contribute toward distrust of the media?
Well, look, I mean, I think that news outlet, you have to have a global perspective on this. The U.S. media environment is unique in that we have this historic tradition, and that's all it is, of quote-unquote objectivity. as a value in the news. And that was really an audience-building strategy, in my view. It was basically, based on the kind of dominance of like a single news source, newspaper in particular markets, and trying to maximize the market and kind of create an environment in which, you could get people of diverse political beliefs to all consume this information, and then you could market it to advertisers. So there's a kind of market imperative behind the kind of tradition of objectivity in the U.S. But in the rest of the world, really, there are exceptions, but in most of the world, news is presented within a kind of political and ideological framework. People consume news outlets because they reflect, their values and their political beliefs.
And we ought to say, historically, as some of you may know, this was true at the beginning of the United States of America as well.
Right.
Especially in the 18th century, this was absolutely true of the American press.
Right, and so the whole, when I say objectivity was kind of the notion of objectivity was a market strategy. It was a market strategy that was really took hold post-war. So it existed before that, but that was this kind of apex. So I think that there are partisan, I wouldn't even call them partisan, that's not fair. There are news organizations that are ideological and have a political perspective. I don't think that's the fundamental driver of polarization at all. I think they contribute in certain ways because of the way, that they report and inform their audiences, and because of the way they're part of a larger information ecosystem that, amplifies and reinforces, and it's just also just a style of audience creation where people really enjoy a kind of put downs and antagonism, and this is what I was going to say. This is the point I lost, and it kind of relates to the broader point. I think that one reason that people like Rush Limbaugh or InfoWars. I've never listened to I've definitely,
I'm going to send you some clips.
Please, I don't know if I've read enough about it. I don't know but I've definitely listened to a lot of Rush Limbaugh while driving across the country or whatever. And I think that, this is the same with Trump and what we were talking about in the break. I think that for a lot of people, and I'm making assumptions here, what they're saying for them, and even maybe objectively, is fundamentally true, that the elites have too much power, and they don't care about you. They really don't. I kind of think that we could probably concede that, that's probably a true statement if you're a kind of working class person in the United States. And then I think their next thing is, the details don't matter. The details really don't. Yeah, they're exaggerating. They're saying things that are maybe kind of made up. But that resonates with me, and I'm not hearing that in other places. So I think that that's kind of what's happening. Audiences are sorting themselves. They're sorting themselves, based on an alignment with certain political ideologies and with a broader perspective about their place in the world, and that is being reinforced. I don't know that, and I think that the deepening polarization that produces is really a function of the way in which that then is kind of reinforced within the kind of political environment. That's what I see as driving and deepening the polarization.
You want to follow up on this before I move on?
Just to say, yeah, I think that's totally right. I think that there are times with Alex Jones will be ranting and during his diatribes, which hurt real people and, make up lies about children who have been murdered and all the other terrible, terrible stuff. There are kernels of truth in what he's saying when he says, your government isn't giving you all the information. Well, that's true, right? Like, there are pieces that ring true to people, and I think, yeah, that's just right.
We had a couple of questions about why isn't the solution to this to go back to the equal time doctrine or the fairness doctrine? And the answer is that the law prohibits it. And I've asked Joel at the break if he would take just a minute or two, because there were a number of people asking about this, and just to briefly walk people through why that is the case.
Yeah, I mean, I think fairness as a principle is something that we value, and I think all journalists of good faith strive for. But you know, government imposed or determined fairness is always somewhat fraught, and there were always constitutional questions around whether this was. You know, there was a debate, at least, that was unresolved about whether this is permitted. But basically, the FCC wasn't a constitutional. You'll correct me on that. It's not a constitutional debate, but there was a sort of political debate, and the FCC, which apportions spectrum during a period in which broadcast frequencies were rare, basically made the argument that. Because this is a scarce resource, and because there's a public interest imperative, if you have access to this resource, then you need to balance both sides in a political debate. And then basically when cable came along and completely made available like the widest range of frequencies, not frequencies, but channels that broadcasters could use, the scarcity argument went out the window. And it basically collapsed, and it's never coming back. Because we've never had, and that was the only basis for the government being able to basically, through the FCC, kind of impose this kind of framework on national broadcasters. But the technology has transformed the environment so completely that there's no justification or rationale for bringing back the fairness doctrine, and now Dick will.
Yeah, no, that's I think correct, and the FCC still has some limited control over those people who are using the broadcast spectrum, but they have much less over cable, and they have none over the internet, and as you all know as consumers, these things are, the way you consume them is pretty much seamless. So even if you imposed it in the places where you maybe still could, and I think the courts would rule that you can't because it's unfair to those providers, you certainly couldn't elsewhere, and it would pretty quickly become pointless.
Yeah, I mean, it was an approach that was adapted to the kind of technological moment. But I'm going to make just a couple quick points. One is, the framework that the FCC used in asserting its authority based on its charters, this idea of public interest, which is a disputed term. What does public interest mean in a kind of in this context? But I actually have been leaning into it and thinking it's something that journalists themselves should sort of reaffirm in terms of what we do and our role and also thinking about how we differentiate between the journalism that is dedicated to informing the public and ensuring greater democratic participation, and journalism that doesn't put the public first, that has other interests, whether they're political interests or what have you. So I mean, I kind of like the framework that was used to justify the fairness doctrine, even if the fairness, which is public interest, even if the fairness doctrine itself is a vestige of the past.
I mean, that's ProPublica, right? That's
absolutely.
I hope so.
It's part of their motto.
And you can tell. I mean, I think when I think of ProPublica, which is kind of the gold standard for me in terms of stories, and it answers this question, which I think about a lot when I'm picking stories, because we get to pick stories, we have editorial control, is why am I telling this story, right? why does it matter? Who does it serve? What is the point? And I think that's a really important question to ask ourselves, and I think that gets to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Somewhat different angle. And a couple of questions again. How much and how often are Russians or other foreign powers spreading disinformation, and how effective are we at stopping it? And have we any sense of how long before 2016 Russia was using disinformation in the United States? Either of you.
Brandy? I have opinions, but you actually are the expert.
Well, I mean, in the 80s, there's this fun story that Kremlin, so there's this conspiracy theory that has lasted quite a while, which is that the virus that caused AIDS was actually born and bred in a lab, I think in Maryland. And it was like, it's known as Operation Infection or Operation Denver. And what it was, the way that the way that the Kremlin did it, or the way that Russia did it, was they made this fake whistleblower story, and they put it in an Indian newspaper. And it was a letter to the editor, and he said, I have secret information that AIDS actually came from a secret place in Maryland, and I am a doctor, so I know what I'm talking about. And it was in this, fake Indian newspaper that was owned by Russia. And that slowly made its way, as these narratives do, to the States, and it was a lingering belief. The way that it works now is that PR firms, or one was the Internet Research Agency, famous troll farm in St. Petersburg, they create these narratives. Maybe it's that the First Lady of Ukraine bought a $4.5 million Bugatti, and they launder it much in the same way they used to, through news sources that they are linked to or that they own, and then they make their way into other fake news sites, and then they make their way as a sponsored post, for instance, in a legitimate African newspaper. And then you have people that are Kremlin-known propagandists and expats that will parrot this stuff on X, and then it makes its way sometimes to a member of Congress like Marjorie Taylor Greene, which that actually happened. So that's how it works. It's worked like that for a long time. It continues to work like that. How effective is it? Not really that effective. When you think about like what is the main goal of it, is to sort of throw these narratives, throw these stories into the ether so that they just sort of live amongst us. Again, most of them don't go anywhere. I track dozens and dozens of them, and most of them don't make it out of step 2, really. They never will appear anywhere. But every once in a while, one will gain traction, and that can have ramifications.
Yeah, no, I think that's an incredibly thorough and wonderful summary of how this process works. And I just have a couple of observations. One is, yes, the most famous example was the one Brandy mentioned, but the strategy has been around since, again, the 1920s. As I mentioned earlier, it was initially referred to as active measures. It was a deliberate strategy. But what technology has done is reduce the cost to zero. So it's basically has zero cost to try. And every day, 100 times a day, Russian, the Russian operatives, if you want to call them that, are trying to plant stories. And I don't know what the percentage is, but I'm just going to throw out, 99% of the time, maybe, they go nowhere. They don't work. And there are two ways that this strategy can harm us. The first is that occasionally it works, and the second is that we panic and take measures to solve a problem that doesn't really exist, and that the measures we take actually either undermine our own democracy or our standing in the world. And this is something I dealt with all the time when I was at the Committee to Protect Journalists, because there was a lot of concern that because, once a decade, Russia succeeded in these, first of all, there's a third way in which they succeed, which is that we believe they have more influence than they actually do. Now, if you're, working for Putin and your job is to try and plant these stories, and you hardly ever have success, but all these people in the United States, including the Democratic Party, believe that you're successful all the time, you're really happy about that. That's wonderful because they're giving you more power than you actually have. So there are two ways in which we can be harmed by this. One is if we attribute more effectiveness to the strategy than it actually has, and we take measures or believe things that aren't true based on our understanding of how this works. So just as an example, I saw, a lot of calls when I was at the Committee to Protect Journalists to restrict Russian media in the US, including things like RT, which is terrible. Let's just stipulate that RT is a Russian propaganda station that attempts to manipulate people and publishes things that are sometimes, some of it, like any good propaganda, a certain amount of it is true, but there's plenty of things that are made up with the intention of confusing people. And so there were a lot of calls to restrict it in various ways. And I thought that was an overreaction and a bad idea, even though I certainly was no fan of RT, because I thought it undermined the US position globally as a defender of press freedom and the rights of journalists. So this is another way this works. So again, it can work either by actually functioning and allow, Russia planting a story that gains traction, or it can work if we overreact and think it's more of a problem than it actually is.
Yeah, the most fun kinds of stories that I get to work on, and I think the most effective in terms of inoculating people from misinformation and disinformation is reporting on these processes, what they look like. So and showing you how it works, right? Showing you the 40 narratives that, the ones we know about have tried to launder this year, including just some really wild tales about organ harvesting, just really wild stuff, and told in a very clumsy manner because it's so cheap. That is very informative. That's very helpful. And when you see how silly it is, and some of these tactics are, it really does lighten or turn down the volume, right? And so it's not like these evil geniuses in Russia. It's actually some pretty silly attempts. And sometimes because we're silly too, sometimes they work.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I would say if you want to sort of have a sense of this, it's the news equivalent of your spam filter. If you ever want to, some of you probably do, some of you probably don't. If you want to have a sense of the craziness of the world, just take a spin through your spam filter on your email one day. You almost certainly get more in your spam filter than you do in your inbox. And that ought to be telling you something. The next question comes from, it's two questions, but the first of them comes from Oli at the University of Georgia, relative to things we can do. What is the merit and prospect for regulation of big platforms such as Meta, Google, X, and relatedly, just to throw this into the mix before we start talking about it, a question that begins, should Congress ban TikTok in the United States? Which actually Congress has set a timetable on banning TikTok in the United States. Yes?
I don't want to say I don't trust the government, so I'm trying to rephrase that. If you've ever seen a hearing on social media and what we can do, if you've ever seen these committees sort of meet and congressional committees meet and discuss and drag these CEOs and tech workers in front of Congress to answer questions, what you will soon quickly learn is that most members of Congress don't know anything about the internet or social media. And so, I mean, I can pretty confidently say that just as a consumer and as a tech journalist, I don't think that they're the best people to be doing this work. But I do think that Europe's doing some things that we're not even beginning to do. I do think there's a step there that that will come first, and there have been attempts to do this, which is platform accountability. measures. So like, I would like to know the algorithms, right? Like maybe that should be public information. Maybe we should understand why we're being served up what we're being served up. That's like basic level number one. I could go for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is, well, there's various challenges. One is just political dysfunction. Nothing gets done in Congress. That's sort of a trope, but it's true. The second is this is a fairly technical area, and many members of Congress, exactly as Brandy described, have no idea how any of this works. The third is we don't even know in what context we want to regulate. Are we regulating around transparency? Are we regulating around market share? Let's point out that Google just lost an antitrust case, and who knows what the remedy will be, but it could really change the information space. I don't think we want to regulate around, content moderation in any way. That I think would be a really bad idea, and would have all sorts of First Amendment implications as well. Although there are proposals around that. I do think that we should have an expectation that technology companies that are shaping perceptions in the way that given the power that they have to shape perceptions, operate with a public interest framework. I don't know how we achieve that, but I think if the technology platforms internalize that in some way, we would be better off, but I don't know how that's achieved, and I'm not sure that regulation is the right way, but just as an ideal, I think that's something we can articulate. And I think that the TikTok ban, the problem the fundamental problem is they singled out TikTok for special treatment, and it may well represent a national security threat in some way. We don't have all the details about that. But you could address that more broadly by imposing transparency requirements across the sector, rather than signaling out TikTok, so that we have requirements around how algorithms work, around privacy, around how information is shared, around how the platforms could use our personal information, about who owns it. There's a whole area of possible regulation that might be worth considering across the sector, but signaling out TikTok on the basis of national security, I think kind of it's a missed opportunity, is what I would say.
Yeah, and of course, the legislation, assuming it is not checked in some way, is going to lead not to the end of TikTok, but to the sale of TikTok. And it would be perfectly compliant with the legislation, for instance, to sell TikTok to someone like Elon Musk, who at this point is avowedly attempting to use his social media platforms to achieve his own personal political agenda. And that would be compliant. The other thing I just want to caution people who are fans of new regulation of platforms is not only what Brandy said, but those regulations will ultimately end up being interpreted by the courts. And if you think that Congress is out of touch with the internet, it is worth remembering that whether you like him or not, Justice Thomas, as the senior justice on the court, Justice Thomas has had the same job now for 35 years, and he has worked with 8 other grown-ups and 3 young people, and that's it for 35 years. So the chances that someone in that work setting, again, without any reflection on his views, is entirely up to speed with the way our information architecture works, seems somewhat low.
So you're saying there's no Supreme Court Slack channel?
Yeah, I think it is unlikely.
Are the justices on Slack? Do they have a Slack room? Does anyone know?
I think it is almost inconceivable.
I do not know.
Next question. The January 6th investigation is a prime example of combating disinformation with logic. How has that gone? would there have been a better approach?
I don't know. How would I know that?
I don't know. What do you think?
What do I think about the January 6th investigation? I thought it was gripping television. I don't know. I mean, in terms of what do we want it to do?
Yeah, I
Has
mean,
that-
is that, I think the question is that extraordinarily detailed disclosure of a wide range of factual information, is that kind of thing effective in your judgment?
I'm making a joke that it was gripping TV, but it was gripping TV. Like, people watched it, and we shared clips on the internet, and I think that it was incredibly informative in terms of like what happened there. In terms of accountability, I don't.
I mean, look, I think, going back to my comment in the first part of this discussion, I mean, I think governments being more transparent and sharing more information with the public and finding different ways of doing it and finding ways of presenting that information in a compelling way, that's all positive. I don't know that because of the way in which it was conducted and the nature of the people participating, I'm not sure that it actually persuaded many people. I don't know what the research is in that area, but I certainly think that it's the right approach to be more public, to be more transparent, to try and put information into the public realm, and to try and do it in a way that people find compelling.
Two more before we're done. One, we talked about government regulation, but what about private regulation of platforms? Should Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn attempt to delete misinformers? What do you think? And should they attempt to delete misinformers, the platforms? What do we think?
I feel like I thought I knew the answer to that at one point, and now I really don't. There are platforms that work better than other platforms in terms of policing mis and disinformation, and that generally the platforms that work well are kind of guided by this North Star, and some Reddit communities, I would say, are among those. There's a forum that I just love in Vermont called Front Porch Forum that is, whoop if you know it, because I adore it. But it's sort of governed by this idea that, like, we want true and polite conversation and something that's in the public and our users' interest. And I feel like that's missing from so many of these platforms. I was very involved with Twitter during the moment and talked with many Twitter executives over the years when they were sort of wrestling with what do we want to, how do we want to regulate? What is the right way to go when it comes to moderation? And I can tell you that the people that worked there at that time didn't always get it right, in my opinion, but sometimes they were too harsh, sometimes they didn't maybe act enough. But they did so with a real effort to get it right. And if there was anything that came out of the Twitter files, it was that these people worked incredibly hard to try to do what was in their users' interest and within the arm of the law and respecting freedom of speech. Now, at the time, I would say I wanted them to make those efforts. I thought that was in the public interest. But now it is owned by a person who has said in an interview recently with Jordan Peterson that he bought Twitter and changed it to X to defeat the woke mind virus, and that this is a political thing for him, that he is out to change hearts and minds, and this is the information that he wants, his information and his point of view. And so do I want him moderating X or Twitter? I don't think so, right? And so I think it's I'm saying conflicting things, but be careful what you wish for, I guess, when it comes to moderation.
Joel, quickly, because we're running out
Okay,
of
so very quickly, what I'll say is, all technology platforms regulate the content that circulates on them under some framework. They remove, certain kinds of, incitement to violence, hate speech, speech that's genuinely dangerous. But the question I think that is still unresolved is, what framework do they use for decision making? You know, what is the broadest way of explaining to the public how they make decisions on what content you know, is allowed and what isn't. They, you know, Facebook has had community standards. Of course, they tried the First Amendment. That didn't really work because everything's permitted under the First Amendment, and it was a toxic environment. So, I mean, I agree with Brandy that, you know, having someone like Musk as the owner of X sort of recalibrates the discussion. But I'm going to go back and just say that as a society, I'm not, you know, I do think that we want a kind of public interest framework applied to this discussion about content moderation. You know, what is it that, what framework would best serve that purpose? I don't think I have an answer to that, but I'm not sure that that's I think that's the right question, and I think that's the one we should be asking.
Yeah, no, a public square that's somehow accountable to the public and moderated in a completely transparent way with user input, and I think that's the way forward if we are going to have this sort of thing. And something has been lost with the loss of X as it was, or loss of Twitter as it was, which is, you know, that was a place where you had verified reporters, you had reliable information that, from government sources that would quickly respond, and you could really get good information fast, and that's been lost.
And that is probably the right note on which to end. Thank you all very much for your attention. I think Anne has some thoughts and logistics, but thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I want to thank our panel for coming today and giving us an education on how to understand the media. I want to also give a plug to next week's talk, Geopolitics, Lessons from the Cold War and the Way Forward, by Sarah Payne, who is a professor at the U.S. Naval War College. Thanks all for coming. See you next week.